During the final week of initiation, we, the fraternity candidates, were blindfolded and stripped of our shoes and phones before being driven 12 miles away from the fraternity house to a secluded beach. It was freezing, and the sand beneath our bare feet made the experience all the more unnerving. The upperclassmen explained the task. We had to return to the fraternity house by sunrise, walking through the cold night in near total silence, to prove our worth. The rules were clear: no talking, no help, and no deviations. We had to trust Chandler, the only one who wasn't blindfolded, to guide us in the right direction. The sound of the van pulling away left us with nothing but the noise of crashing waves and distant wind. As I stood there blindfolded, every sound felt amplified: the rustling of the wind through nearby bushes, the faint calls of distant seagulls. The anxiety of not knowing the landscape around us started to creep in. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, and the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. It wasn't long before we were nudged to start moving, each of us tied loosely by the wrists for what felt like an added layer of disorientation. Our group moved cautiously, led by Chandler, who occasionally tugged us forward or called out softly to adjust our direction. The sand beneath our feet alternated between firm and shifting, and the cold air stung against my face. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of the waves and the faint crunch of sand beneath our feet. My mind wandered between trying to gauge the distance we'd covered and resisting the urge to speak. The silence felt oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. Then, something unusual happened. As I stepped forward, my foot sank deeper into the wet sand, and I felt cold water pooling around my ankles. It didn't make sense. We were supposed to stay far from the tide, yet the sound of waves seemed louder, closer. I tightened my grip on the rope linking us, trying to ignore the growing unease. Chandler kept moving, but my senses screamed that something was off. The thought of breaking formation crossed my mind, but fear of the unknown kept me in line. When the unease became too much, I finally dared to peek beneath my blindfold. What I saw stopped me cold. The person ahead of me, Whitworth, was no longer there. Instead, a middle-aged man stood in his place, gripping a knife that glinted under the moonlight. My breath hitched as I scanned the area and noticed a small boat anchored nearby, its occupants watching us like vultures circling prey. Their silhouettes were barely visible, but the menace in their posture was unmistakable. Panic surged through me, and my grip on the rope slackened. I wanted to scream, but fear choked the sound before it could leave my throat. The man with the knife turned his head slightly, as if sensing my hesitation. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who were these people? What did they want? And where was Whitworth? As my legs trembled, the realization hit me: if I didn't act, none of us would leave this beach alive. Summoning every ounce of courage, I shoved the man with the knife as hard as I could, breaking free from the group and bolting toward the open beach. My bare feet pounded against the sand, adrenaline drowning out the pain from the cold and sharp shells beneath me. I heard the shouts of my group behind me, followed by a commotion as they too began to run. My lungs burned as I pushed forward, desperate to reach safety. The beach seemed endless, but the faint glow of dawn on the horizon spurred me on. Finally, I stumbled upon a patrol car parked near a dune. Gasping for air, I shouted for help, relaying the horror we'd just escaped. By the time the officers reached the spot, the men, their boat, and any trace of their presence had vanished. It was as if they were ghosts, leaving behind nothing but the lingering terror in our hearts. Weeks passed, and just as I began to convince myself that the ordeal was over, a chilling discovery shattered my fragile sense of safety. While walking near the fraternity house, I noticed something strange: a piece of fabric tied to a stick buried in the sand. As I got closer, my blood ran cold. It was a torn piece of the shirt I had worn on that night, the edges frayed exactly where the knife had grazed me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut: they knew who I was, and worse, they knew where to find me. I showed the fabric to Chandler and the others, hoping to make sense of it. Their faces mirrored the same dread that churned in my stomach. Though the police were informed once more, there was little they could do without concrete leads. Nights became sleepless, every shadow outside the window a potential threat. The fraternity house, once a symbol of brotherhood and safety, now felt like a prison under siege. The piece of fabric was a message, clear and deliberate. It wasn't just a memory of that terrifying night, it was a promise that they weren't finished. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, became a reminder that somewhere out there, they were still watching. The initiation ritual started like any other. Blindfolded, we were loaded into vans and driven to an unknown location. I could hear the nervous laughter of others, the sound of tires on gravel, and the occasional whisper between the fraternity members who were leading the process. When the van stopped, they told us to form groups of 3 and stick together. My group included me, Whitworth, and Chandler, who was the only one not blindfolded since he was our guide. I felt the cool night air hit my face as we were told to begin walking. As we walked along what felt like a beach, I could hear the sound of waves crashing and the occasional gull overhead. Chandler kept directing us, but the journey felt endless. My feet ached from walking on uneven terrain, and I could feel sand creeping into my shoes. Every now and then, someone tripped or stumbled, and Chandler would mutter something under his breath, annoyed. It wasn't until I noticed the faint sensation of water lapping at my ankles that I realized something was off. I tugged at Chandler's sleeve and whispered, "Are we supposed to be this close to the water?" He hesitated before replying, "Just keep walking." That hesitation sent a chill down my spine. I tried to focus on the sounds around me, but everything felt eerily quiet, except for the ocean. When Chandler told us to stop, I felt the grip of panic tighten in my chest. "Wait here," he said, walking ahead. I could hear Whitworth's uneasy breathing beside me, and before I could say anything, a hand roughly grabbed my arm. "What?" I started, but the blindfold was ripped off, and I found myself face to face with a man wearing a Guy Fawkes mask. I froze. The man in the mask stood inches from me, holding a knife glinting under the moonlight. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. "Who are you? Where's Chandler?" I managed to stammer, but the masked man said nothing. He tilted his head slightly, as if mocking my fear. Then, in one swift motion, he lunged toward me. Instinct took over, and I ducked, barely avoiding the blade. I scrambled backward, shouting for Whitworth, but there was no reply. Desperation kicked in as I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear his footsteps behind me, fast and relentless. The uneven terrain made it hard to keep my balance, and I tripped several times, scraping my hands and knees. I didn't dare look back, I just kept running, the adrenaline fueling me. Finally, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It had to be the group. Summoning every ounce of energy, I screamed, "Help! There's someone here." My voice cracked, but it was enough to alert them. When I burst into the clearing where the others were, everyone turned to look at me, confused and alarmed. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, and tried to explain what had happened. "A man, in a mask, he has a knife," I managed to choke out. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was part of the initiation, but the fear in my eyes must have convinced them otherwise. The senior members decided to investigate, despite my protests, and we all ventured cautiously into the woods. When I finally reached the fraternity group, still out of breath and my body on high alert, I tried to explain what had happened, but my voice was trembling. "There's someone in the woods, masked, they have a knife," I stammered, trying to contain my panic. Some laughed, thinking I was making it up, while others looked at me with concern. My clothes were dirty with dirt and leaves, and my face stung from scratches. One of the seniors, visibly irritated, decided to accompany me back to the spot where I had last seen them. Despite my fear, I knew I needed to prove I wasn't imagining things. We walked together along the trail, and I held myself back from shaking as I pointed the direction. When we got close to the area I mentioned, we heard voices, low murmurs, as if people were whispering something incomprehensible. My heart raced, and I gestured for silence. As we approached cautiously, we saw a bonfire illuminating the faces of several masked individuals. They were sitting in a circle, performing some kind of ritual, seemingly oblivious to our presence. The flickering firelight highlighted the details of their masks, making the scene even more terrifying. That's when one of the seniors, trying to prove he wasn't scared, stepped on a dry branch. The sound seemed to echo through the forest, and all the heads turned toward us at the same time. For a second, everything was silent. Then, one of the masked figures shouted something we couldn't understand, and the entire group stood up at once, running toward us. I had never been so scared in my life. We ran as fast as we could back to the group, yelling for everyone to flee. The sound of heavy footsteps and guttural screams echoed behind us as we tried to escape the forest. We managed to reach the safety of the fraternity house, and the police were called immediately. We reported everything we had seen, but when the officers arrived at the location, the masked figures and the bonfire had vanished. All that remained were marks on the ground, indicating that something had indeed happened there. The sense of unease lingered, but we tried to move on, believing it was just an isolated incident and that they didn't know who we were. However, days later, something terrifying happened. As I was leaving the house to go to class, I noticed something hanging from one of the trees in the yard. My heart froze. It was a mask identical to the ones the masked figures wore in the forest, carefully hung as if it were a warning. I called the other fraternity members, and everyone was shocked. The mask seemed to be staring directly at the house, as if to say they knew where we were. The police were called again, but once more, they found no concrete evidence of who might have left it there. Despite the investigations, the case was never solved. Nights became tense, and any noise in the house or yard made my heart race. We couldn't shake the thought that, wherever they were, those people knew exactly where to find us. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but the memory of that mask haunts me every time I close my eyes. We were blindfolded and guided into what we were told was an abandoned metro tunnel, a part of our fraternity's initiation ritual. The air was damp and heavy, echoing every whisper and step. As we were separated into smaller groups, the instructions were clear: walk straight along the tracks between active platforms and, under no circumstances, touch the electrified rails. It sounded simple, but the growing tension in my chest warned me otherwise. My group was led further down the tunnel until we could barely hear the muffled voices of the others. As we moved deeper, I began to feel the overwhelming isolation of the space. The sound of dripping water and the occasional rumble from above only amplified the eerie atmosphere. The blindfold, meant to add an element of mystery, now felt suffocating. Each step was cautious, every sound behind us sparking suspicion. We tried to joke to lighten the mood, but even laughter felt out of place. The deeper we went, the more I felt the weight of something unnatural surrounding us. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle, a metallic clinking sound ahead. It didn't match the echo of our footsteps. It felt deliberate, intentional, like someone or something was letting us know they were there. The person guiding us told us to stop. "Wait here," he said, his voice shaky. But the longer we waited, the louder the clinking became. Then, the guide whispered, "Run," and disappeared into the darkness. When we turned to follow the guide's panicked footsteps, we realized he wasn't with us anymore. My heart sank as I heard someone behind us, not running, but walking at a steady, deliberate pace. My friend whispered, "Someone's back there." We turned, our blindfold still on, but the sound was clear, a set of heavy boots slowly closing in. The air felt colder, the silence between each step dragging us deeper into fear. Finally, I ripped off my blindfold. Standing just a few feet away was a man I had never seen before. His face was illuminated only by the faint glow of the emergency tunnel lights. He wasn't wearing fraternity gear, nor did he look lost. His presence felt wrong, his body too still, his head tilted as if analyzing us. When he took a step forward, my friend yelled, "Run!" Without hesitation, we sprinted down the tunnel, ignoring the electrified rails on either side. But the man didn't chase us the way I expected. His steps stayed slow, deliberate. It wasn't about catching us, it was about letting us know he could. Each time we slowed, his presence became louder, the scraping of boots, the faint sound of his breathing. My adrenaline was the only thing keeping me from collapsing, but the growing realization hit me: this wasn't just someone lost in the tunnels. He was waiting for us. In our panic, we reached a junction where the tunnel split into two paths. My friend shouted, "Left or right?" but I could barely think. The sound of the man's boots echoed from both directions, disorienting us further. Without thinking, we crossed onto the opposite tracks, risking everything by stepping onto the electrified rail path. Every nerve in my body screamed as we sprinted, hoping the platform wasn't far. Halfway down the tunnel, we saw a faint light. The safety of the platform was close. But so was he. His silhouette appeared again in the faint glow of an approaching train. My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks. I yanked him up, and we scrambled forward, barely avoiding the train as it thundered past. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the man fully. He wasn't moving. He stood there, unbothered by the approaching train, as if daring it to hit him. When we finally reached the platform, we collapsed, gasping for air. Looking back into the tunnel, we expected to see him mangled or gone. But he wasn't there. There was no trace of him at all. It was as if he had vanished into the dark, leaving only the echo of his boots as a reminder of how close he had come. Even as I stood on the platform, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there. My friend tried to rationalize it, saying it was probably a homeless man or someone playing a sick joke. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. His movements, his silence, the way he seemed to know the tunnels better than we did, it didn't feel human. As the train pulled away, I stared into the darkness, half expecting him to step out again. In the days that followed, I avoided telling anyone else what had happened. The other fraternity members dismissed it as nerves or imagination, but my friend and I knew the truth. The tunnels weren't just abandoned. They had a presence, something lingering and waiting. Even now, I can't hear the sound of boots on concrete without freezing, my mind dragging me back to that night. The fear hasn't faded. Every shadow feels like him, every echo of footsteps a reminder. Maybe he was just a man. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, those tunnels hold something far darker than the empty tracks. And I'll never go back to find out.